There is a moment on a cold morning in the fall of 1988 when a 24-year-old named Cole Merrick stands in the gravel yard of a walnut plant in Stockton, Missouri, and watches a machine the size of a boxcar swallow the first load of shells and turn them to ash. He does not move. Behind him waits a mountain of hulled black walnut shell, nearly 2,000 tons of it, an entire season's worth, waiting its turn to burn. The man who scheduled that fire stands 40 feet away with his arms crossed. And he is not wrong about a single thing he has said. The shell has no feed value. It is heavy. It costs money to haul and money to store. And the pile is a fire hazard that keeps him up at night. Every fact Dale Rourke has on his side is true. And Cole has 90 days. 90 days, one soil lab report, and a phone number on the back of a feed receipt to prove that the part of the walnut everyone in that county had been burning since before he was born was worth more than the nut inside it. They had laughed at him at the co-op counter. They called it Merrick's magic garbage. A grown man, they said, does not build a future out of what a factory throws in the fire. But to understand how Cole Merrick ended up standing between a furnace and a fortune, we have to go back to a small town in the Missouri Ozarks, and to a rule everyone there had followed for 100 years, without once asking whether it was true. Let me tell you about walnuts, because you cannot understand the shell until you understand the nut. Stockton sits in Cedar County, in the rolling Ozark Hills of southwest Missouri, where the black walnut trees grow wild along every fence line and creek bottom. For 100 years, the black walnut had been a fall cash crop for people who had very little cash. When the first frost knocked the nuts loose, whole families drove the back roads with feed sacks and pickup beds, hauling them into the hulling station in town. There, a machine stripped off the thick green hull. The nuts were run across a scale and the grower was paid by the pound. Then the plant cracked the shell, picked out the kernel, that small, dark, oily meat the whole operation existed to produce, and sold it on to bakeries and candy makers across the country. That kernel was the crop. That kernel was the point. And the shell? The hard, woody shell that made up nearly half the weight of everything hauled in was what was left over. It rode out the back on a conveyor to a pile in the yard, and when the pile got too big, they burned it. Nobody had studied the question. Nobody had ever voted on it. That was simply what you did with shell. It was the part of the walnut that was not the nut. It was debris, and in Cedar County, that had been the logic for longer than anyone alive could remember. Cole Merrick had grown up inside that logic. His grandfather, Amos, had run a small hulling station out on Route H for 30 years, and Cole had spent every fall of his boyhood shoulder-deep in walnuts, his hands stained black to the wrist. Amos was not an educated man, but he was a watchful one, and he used to say something Cole never forgot, that nothing off a walnut tree was truly waste, that folks just had not gotten around yet to finding what the rest was for. When Amos died, the little station closed, and the equipment sat rusting under a tin roof. Cole took a job at the big plant in town, running the conveyor that carried the cracked shell out to the burn pile. He watched that shell burn load after load for 2 years. And the longer he watched, the more his grandfather's words sat wrong in his stomach. So Cole started asking the question nobody around him had bothered to ask. What is this stuff actually made of? And is anybody, anywhere, paying money for it? He drove 40 miles north to the University of Missouri Extension office, and there he met Nora Kessler, who ran the county soil and materials lab and had a rare habit of taking odd questions seriously when everyone else waved them off. Cole set a coffee can of ground shell on her counter and asked her, plainly, to tell him what it was. Most people would have smiled and sent him home. Nora ran the tests, and when the numbers came back, she was the first person in Cedar County to look Cole Merrick in the eye and tell him, without a trace of a smile, that he might just be standing on something real. The plant was run by a man named Dale Rourke. And if you are going to understand this story, you have to understand that Dale was not the villain of it. Dale was 56, and he had given 30 years to the walnut business, working his way up from the crack line to plant manager one honest season at a time. He was not cruel, he was careful, and by the fall of 1988, he was carrying a problem that kept him up at night. The shell pile had gotten out of hand. 2 decades of shell had built into a small mountain behind the plant, and a mountain of dry, oily, woody waste does one thing above all others. It waits to catch fire. The county had sent a letter. The insurance man had raised the rate twice. Dale had gone to the owners and won approval for a permanent solution, an industrial incinerator that would burn the shell down as fast as it came off the line and clear the yard for good. The unit was scheduled to come online in 90 days. When it did, the entire standing pile would be the very first thing fed into it. So when Cole came to his office and said, respectfully, that the plant ought to be selling the shell instead of burning it, Dale did not throw him out. He listened. Then he leaned back and said, not unkindly, that he had been in walnuts since before Cole was in short pants, and that if there had been a nickel to be made in that shell, somebody smarter than either of them would have found it 30 years back. He said the shell had no food value, that it was too heavy to haul anywhere at a profit, and that it was one dry summer away from burning the whole plant to the ground and putting 40 people out of work. Every word of that was true, and that was exactly what made Dale Rourke so impossible to argue with. He was not wrong. He was just not finished being right. So Cole was left holding a number, and the number was 90 days. He had until the incinerator came online to prove Dale wrong, not with a speech, but with a buyer. Because Dale, to his credit, had told him one more thing on the way out. If Cole could bring a real, paying customer to the plant before the burn date, someone willing to take the shell at a price that beat the cost of hauling it to the fire, then Dale would hold the pile and talk terms. But only until the machine started. After that, the pile went in, and the question was closed for good. Cole had a soil lab report and a coffee can of ground shell. What he did not have was a single customer, a truck, a grinder that could process shell to a consistent grade, or any real idea who actually bought crushed walnut shell. So he worked the plant floor by day and the telephone by night, calling every number Nora could dig out of trade directories, anybody who might have a use for a hard, gritty powder. Most never called back. The ones who did wanted to know how many tons he could deliver, on what schedule, at what specification, and Cole, standing in his grandfather's rusting shed with a coffee can, had no honest answer. Word got around town the way word does. At the co-op counter, they took to calling it Merrick's magic garbage, loud enough for him to hear. Nora kept running samples on her own time, after the office went dark, because she believed the numbers even when the town did not. And Cole came to understand, with every week the pile inched closer to the fire, that if this failed, he would not just lose an idea. He would lose the last thing his grandfather ever handed him, and drag the one person who had believed in him down into the failure alongside him. For 70 of those 90 days, nothing worked at all. And then, in the space of a single week in October, everything happened at once. The break came first. A man named Verl Tanner, a drilling supply broker out of Tulsa, whom Nora had reached through a petroleum engineering contact at the university, returned Cole's call on a Monday morning. He wanted it for the oil field. Ground walnut shell, he explained, was one of the finest materials known for sealing off the cracks deep inside a well bore, plugging the fractures that swallowed a driller's mud. He had rigs down in Oklahoma losing circulation every week, and he could not get good shell fast enough. He wanted a rail car load to run through a test well, and if it performed the way he expected, he would sign a standing contract for everything the plant could produce. And then, in the same week, the sky turned against Cole. October came in bone dry. and a grass fire jumped a ditch 2 miles from the plant and burned 100 acres black before the trucks could knock it down. The insurance company telephoned Dale the next morning. By that afternoon, the owners had made their decision, and it was not a cruel one, it was a reasonable one. They would not sit on 2,000 tons of oily shell through a drought, waiting 3 weeks for a machine that had not arrived. The pile would be burned by hand, in the open, in 6 days. 6 days. Cole now had a buyer who needed a certified sample, a pile about to become a column of smoke, and no grinder, no rail car, and no signed contract. Every small problem he had carried for 70 days landed on his shoulders together in a single gray afternoon. What Cole did in those 6 days, he did on almost no sleep, and he did not do it alone. He drove out to Route H and hauled his grandfather's old shell grinder out of the shed, a rusted, belt-driven machine Amos had used to make poultry grit 40 years before. He and Nora rebuilt it over a single weekend, getting the old motor running again. Then they ran the plant's shell through it, and Nora graded the output on her own lab bench, screening it to the exact particle specification Tanner's telex had demanded, and bagging it with a state university lab number stamped on every sack, so no man could wave it off as a farmer's guess. Cole talked a rail car out of the co-op manager on a handshake, then loaded it himself, by scoop, through the night. And then he did the thing that took more nerve than all the rest. He telephoned Verl Tanner and asked him not for a test order, but for a letter, a signed purchase commitment on company paper for the plant's entire season of shell, contingent only on the sample passing. Tanner, who had spent his life around men who talked bigger than they delivered, asked exactly one question. Could he stand behind that specification? Cole told him the specification was Nora Kessler's, out of a state university laboratory, and that he would stake everything he owned on it. 2 days later, the letter came clattering across the co-op's telex machine, and Cole tore it off the roll with shaking hands. On the morning of the burn, Cole Merrick drove through the plant gate with that letter folded in his coat pocket and a certified numbered sample in the bed of his truck. He walked across the frozen gravel yard to where Dale Rourke stood with a crew of 4 men and 2 drip torches, waiting to set a season's harvest on fire. Dale saw him coming across the yard and raised a hand to tell the crew to hold. Cole handed him the letter without a single word. Dale Rourke read it once, standing there in the cold, with a drip torch still hanging in his other hand. Then he read it again, more slowly. It was a purchase commitment for the plant's entire annual output of shell, at a delivered price that did not merely beat the cost of hauling it to the fire. It turned the plant's single largest waste stream into a standing line of revenue. For a long moment, Dale did not say anything at all. The torches hissed in the cold air. Then Dale looked up, and to his great and lasting credit, he did not reach for a single excuse. He said quietly, "I have been burning this for 30 years, son." Cole said he knew. Dale looked at the mountain of shell, and then down at the letter. And then he said the thing Cole had driven 90 days to hear. He said, "I was wrong about the shell." Then he turned to his crew and said, "Put out the torches." He put his hand out, and Cole shook it. And neither man said anything more because nothing more needed saying. Then Dale did one last thing. He told Cole that if that sample passed, the plant would need somebody who understood the grinding and the grades to run the new side of the business, and that the job was Cole's if he wanted it. Nora was waiting for him by the gate when Cole walked back out. He handed her the letter because her lab number was stamped in the corner of every page, and it was every bit as much hers as his. She read it through once, and then she finally let herself smile. They would be married the following spring. In the same month, the first full rail cars rolled south toward Oklahoma. But on that morning, at that gate, they simply stood side by side and watched the pile that was supposed to burn, and did not. Now let me tell you what was actually true about that shell, because the science is the whole reason this story could happen at all. Black walnut shell is one of the hardest natural materials a farm will ever produce. It is dense, sharp, and slow to break down. And those exact properties, the ones that made it useless as feed and a nuisance to burn, are the ones that make it valuable. Ground into grit, walnut shell is a premium abrasive blasting media, hard enough to strip paint and clean metal, yet soft enough that it will not scar the surface underneath. Clean enough for jet engine parts and delicate machinery alike. Ground finer, it becomes the gentle scrubbing agent in soaps and cosmetics. And ground to the right grade, it is one of the most effective lost circulation materials in all of oil and gas drilling, plugging the deep fractures in a well that would otherwise swallow a driller's fluid whole. The largest black walnut processor in the world sits in that very corner of Missouri to this day, and it now runs an entire division built on nothing but the shell, the part of the harvest that Cedar County spent 100 years feeding to the fire. The shell never once got more valuable. People simply started, at long last, to look at it. The nut was always the crop. It turned out that the shell was the business. So, here is my question for you. Have you ever watched an industry burn, bury, or throw away something you knew in your gut had real value and stayed quiet because every last person around you was so certain there was nothing there? What was it? And what do you suppose that certainty ended up costing them and costing you? Tell me down in the comments. I read every one of them.